the aims of a minimal impact plan is to reduce the impact so that the next group or future generations can still see and value the things that people are going along to see today. The best way to do that is to point out a number of key points in your briefing. Those key areas are things like being aware of sensitive areas, restricted areas, sticking to designated routes along the way, low impact equipment, following the protocols that have been put in place by either an environmental management plan or a cultural management plan that you as the guide would have referred to before you took this group on the trip. You need to ensure that participants don't damage or souvenir anything as we go along the way. People, certainly in the past, would take either stones, tree branches, leaves, or cultural relics that they thought were cool and they wanted to take home so they can remember their trip. So it's important to encourage people and tell people at the start of the day that that's not appropriate on this trip. They leave only footprints, take only photos. Where possible, you're going to need to implement basic biosecurity measures. What that means is in some places, particularly national parks, various weeds or fungus can be spread by the mud on people's boots. You may see things like washdown stations at the start of a track where people are expected to scrub their boots down so people aren't transporting a particular type of fungus that may live in the dirt. One example of this is Phytophthora. Now, Phytophthora is a fungus that can go through the soil and be transferred and pass through the soil, and it kills a lot of plants through their roots. Now, this can be transferred through mud. So if you happen to have walked through an area containing Phytophthora and then you transport that to somewhere else, that's a real problem for the vegetation in that area. And you can't really get it out. It is a very big problem, and basically it drastically reduces the biodiversity of an area by killing the plants from the roots up. Another biosecurity problem would be the transfer of weeds and the seeds associated with weeds. We see this in many natural areas. The problem is that an area may be relatively free of weeds, but some weeds are not only foreign or non-native to an area, they can be invasive weeds. And what that means is once introduced, they will invade an area and actually actively remove the native plants, take over and smother them, because there are no predators for that weed, and therefore it can actively displace the native vegetation, once again drastically reducing the biodiversity of an area. In many places, and it does depend a bit on the activity, is taking appropriate measures for the removal of human waste. Now, although it's not always popular to talk about, we need to think about particularly waterways. So solids, in terms of human waste solids, need to be well away from any waterway, because the bacteria in our feces can spread through a water system, making it undrinkable, and making it certainly a hazard to other people who might be using it as drinking water. And so we really want to, if there are not proper toilet facilities in a location, often nowadays it'll be expected to, if you carry it in, you carry it out, and that includes your waste. Okay, so it is almost becoming common now to have to poo in a plastic bag of some description, and you store it in like a PVC pipe with a screw lid at both ends. And particularly on raft trips, areas where you simply can't necessarily get away from a large body of water, which can easily be contaminated by human waste, it's expected that you would put it in the poo tube and take it home with you and dispose of it once you're out of that sensitive area. It's a bit more difficult for water waste, where you need to go and pee, simply because depending on how many days you're out, that's a lot of water to be carrying. But there's a range of options there too, often it might be better that everyone doesn't wee in the same spot, that it's actually distributed. So we need to think about how you're going to manage human waste in order to minimise your environmental impact. Something to consider is also using low impact equipment. Now, it might sound strange, but there is a range of equipment choices out there, and some of them are now factoring in how much damage, even things like pegs, or how much you're smothering the ground, or when you're using equipment, you may want to consider moving it from place to place. So if you're going to camp somewhere for a week, maybe don't leave your tent in the same spot for the whole week, because what that does is if there's grass or other vegetation under your tent, if you block that and from sunlight and water, and you squash it flat with your feet or your body lying on it, you're drastically reducing the health of that plant, if not killing it. And so all you end up with is dead dirt patches all around the place. So style of pegs is something to consider. How deeply you drive them into the ground is something you consider. Whether you should be tying off your tent on loose trees where it's going to damage the tree. You just want to think about this sort of stuff when you're out there. Trekking poles are very popular these days. However, they can have effects on rocks and the soil as you walk along. So you often will not see people talking about it, but I've seen rocks scoured, lichen scraped off rocks because of trekking poles. And people might say, oh, look, it's only a rock. But some of these lichens are a threatened species that we should be trying to preserve and look after. And certainly advertise and bring it to people's attention before we go on the walk. So that way we can discourage them to use, or encourage them to use their trekking poles appropriately, and be careful of where they're actually placing them, and not to just drive them into the ground mindlessly.